Hey there. So, as we bring the introduction to our Story of God series to a close, we end with the story of the Tower of Babel and how all forms of paganism originated from this point. If you recall, in our last session, we talked about the lineage that descended from the three sons of Noah. Remember, Noah was from the righteous line of Seth. In fact, he was the only one at the time when the whole world had gone wicked, the only one who had found favor in God's eyes. And he had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. There's something unique about how Moses lists these three sons in Genesis 5:32, the last verse. He names them out of birth order. He names Shem, who's the middle son, first. And then he names Ham, and then Japheth, who's the eldest son, he names last. And there's a very specific reason for that. And that is because in these ancient languages of both Hebrew and Greek, word order in lists of people or lists of things actually matters. And typically the most important item is listed first to give it some kind of an emphasis. So we have to ask the question, well, why would Moses list Shem first? And why is Ham, who's the youngest, why is he mentioned before the eldest son? Well, it has to do with their posterity. It has to do with their legacy, if you will. We know that in the post-flood world, the descendants of Shem eventually gave rise to the line of Christ. And Ham, who's, again, the youngest but mentioned second, he gave rise to those nations that would oppose the Jews in the Promised Land, the nations that basically went pagan, stayed pagan. And with Ham's son Canaan, Canaan, obviously not just the father of the Canaanites, but he also spawned, if you will, the Amorites or the Jebusites, and so on. And so Ham gets mentioned before his eldest brother because in some ways he's like the main villain in much of the Old Testament story, at least from the sense that he is, I guess, would be considered the patriarch of all of these different nations that oppose the Jews. But also because Ham's grandson Nimrod was the first king in the post-flood era, and he was worshipped as a god. And the worship of him and his wife, as I'll explain in a little bit, basically is the beginning of all paganism. Now, as far as Ham goes, here is his unfortunate legacy. Ham had four sons, and the son Cush, who was the father of Nimrod, Nimrod basically founded what would later become known as the Babylonian as well as the Assyrian empires. Another son, Mizraim, the Septuagint actually names him Egypt. He was the father of the Egyptians as well as the Philistines. They had a brother named Put, or Phut, P-H-U-T, and he founded the Libyan nations, Libya being the part of the northern African continent that's just to the west of Egypt. And then there was Canaan, who again was the father of the Canaanites, but the Amorites and the Jebusites. And the main capital city of the Jebusites was a city named Jebus, which was the city that was conquered by King David and very quickly named Jerusalem. Right. So there's a very, very deep intertwining of the story of the beginning of the nation of Israel, as well as the story of the beginning of all the different nations in and around the Middle East, and of course all around the world, which will be part of our topic of conversation as we go through. So go to Genesis chapter 10 for me. I just want to read a couple of verses here before we get into Genesis 11. Genesis 10:6 says, the sons of Ham were Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. I'm reading from the Septuagint, that's why it calls Mizraim Egypt. The sons of Cush were Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Septeka. The sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. Verse 8 says, Cush begat Nimrod. He was the first to be a giant on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord God. Because of this, they will say, as Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, the interesting thing there is that, here we have Moses who's writing, about 900 years after the flood, maybe 850 years, something like that. And pardon me, he's still saying, basically he's saying that we have a saying today that we can track all the way back to Nimrod, to the flood or to the post-flood era, as Nimrod was a mighty hunter. And verse 10 says, in the beginning of his kingdom, being Nimrod, became Babylon and Erech, E-R-E-C-H. And that city quite often is also named Uruk, U-R-U-K, as well as Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. And Shinar is a term, it's a Hebrew word that is basically refers to the Mesopotamian area. In fact, if you take a look at the picture on the screen there with that circle, that would be the Mesopotamian area. Sorry. Now, the Septuagint there, where we just read in Genesis, says that Nimrod was the first to be a giant on the earth. And here the Septuagint uses the same word, Greek word gigantes, as it does in Genesis 6, where it talks about the giants being on the earth before the flood and during the time when the sons of God were marrying and having children with the daughters of men. The Hebrew Old Testament says Nimrod began to be a giant, which obviously implies that he wasn't born a giant, right? He became a giant over time. But it also means that, since we know that all flesh other than Noah's family died in the flood, there's no way that Nimrod was one of these mythical angel human hybrids, right? He was born of a human father and mother, descended from Noah. And this supports our contention, of course, that giants in the giants in the days of Noah were simply tyrants and oppressors. They were intimidators. They were not angel-human hybrids. And in fact, Genesis 6 further explains or describes these pre-flood giants by saying they were mighty men of old, the men of renown. And that phrase, the men of renown, just basically means that they were famous, or probably better to say infamous, because they had a bad reputation for being cruel and oppressive. Now, Genesis 10 says the same thing of Nimrod. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, Genesis verse 10 that we just read also says that the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom became Babylon. And this goes back to what I was saying before. Remember in one of our earlier lessons, when we were talking about the Garden of Eden, I talked about how important it is to understand the point of reference, right? Is the writer using directions in the case of the Garden of Eden, or names that are familiar to them in their time, or is he using names that might be ancient or historical? So when it says that the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom became Babylon, it implies that the name was something different prior to that, right? Moses and the people of his day knew that area, knew that city as Babylon, but it was known as something before, and it actually was known as the city of Babel. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So again, Moses is using different terminology. He's using things that his readers would understand. So what we know about Nimrod is that he was the founder of what would later become known as the region of Mesopotamia. And that's on the screen. That circle basically encompasses the land of Iraq down to the northern end of the Persian Gulf on the bottom of the screen. But it also extends up to the eastern part of Syria and the southern part of Turkey. Basically, it's the land that sits in and immediately surrounding the Tigris and the Euphrates. And of course, that's biblically important because this is part of the promised land that God eventually promised to a man named Abraham, which we're not to that story yet. But this period, or not this period, but this piece of land over the next, certainly hundreds, if not thousands of years, basically was populated and controlled by, at different times by the Akkadians, right? That the city Akkad that was founded by Nimrod gave rise to the Akkadian civilization. So this part of the world's geography was, first controlled by the Akkadians and the Sumerians. Later, it came under control of the Assyrians. Then it became under control of the Babylonians. And if you're familiar with Nebuchadnezzar's dream in the book of Daniel, basically the list of nations, right? So we go from the Babylonians to the Persians under Cyrus the Great, to the Greeks with Alexander the Great, and eventually the Romans at the time of Christ. They all at different times control this region, and they controlled it by taking it away from the previous rulers. Now, that's kind of a general geographic lesson, but what did these cities look like? If we say that Nimrod founded cities like Nineveh and Akkad and Uruk, and Babel, what did they look like? Like, if I use the word city today, you probably think of our modern cities, right? Houses and buildings and cars and planes flying around an airport and maybe shopping malls, all that kind of. But what were these cities like? Were they thriving metropolises? Were they densely populated? Were they just scattered small villages and people fighting each other with sticks? Well, I think they're all valid questions. On the screen there, the picture on the right is a picture of an archaeological dig in the area of ancient Samaria, and the city that's pictured there is apparently the city of Uruk. Moses calls it Erech, and it's one of the cities that's founded by Nimrod. And according to the archaeologists, Uruk was a trading hub. There wasn't not a lot of natural resources in that area, so they developed a system of trading with neighboring communities or cities. Apparently, the city here had a system of irrigation canals that were designed to bring water from the Tigris and the Euphrates so that they could use it for farming. So obviously these post-flood people had some knowledge and expertise. What's unique about this particular city is that it actually had 6 miles of defensive walls built around the city itself, which implies a couple of things: knowledge of military strategy, but it also implies that there was war, that there was combat, that there was battle. And in fact, I'll mention a little bit later that the cities of these early pre-flood civilizations were constantly fighting with each other over like border skirmishes and land control. Most of these cities were built around a central pagan temple called a ziggurat, and that's the picture on the left-hand side, was kind of a classic representation. And again, these were pagan temples. They were rectangular in shape. They were very large. And this particular city of Uruk, the estimates are that it housed between 40 and 80,000 people. Now, I don't have a timestamp on that. I don't know how many hundreds of years after the flood this would be. So we don't know if the city, when Nimrod founded it, the city of Erech or Uruk, whether it had 40,000 people or maybe it started out with 7. We don't know, but we know that perhaps at its height it had up to 80,000 people, and the archaeologists say that most likely it was the largest city in the world at the time. The people that lived in that city typically lived in homes that were made from like bundled reeds or straw, like marsh reeds that you would find around the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Or, they would live in houses made of mud bricks. And obviously they had the knowledge to build a city, to dig irrigation canals, to build defensive walls, and to even make bricks. There's an ancient document. Actually, I believe it's a clay tablet, or it's one of those kind of cylinders around which we have, things like cuneiform writing. But there's something called the List of Kings. And apparently, according to this List of Kings, the city of Uruk was founded by a king named Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh, apparently his exploits in his life were memorialized in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some of you guys may have read it. I actually read that when I was in college. The Epic of Gilgamesh is considered the oldest piece of literature. It is, from our time, considered to be the first book that was ever written, the first story. But many experts believe Gilgamesh to actually be Nimrod, the son of Ham, the son of Noah. So he was a Babylonian king. He was the founder of the city of Uruk, which is probably the largest, and was probably the capital of what would later become the Babylonian Empire. But again, many experts, both, certainly within the religious community, believe that Gilgamesh was Nimrod. And even some secular scholars who agree that Nimrod was a historical figure believe that Gilgamesh was actually Nimrod. Now, here is where Uruk is. If we look at a zoomed-in picture of the ancient world, you see Uruk right down at the bottom of the screen, and that would be just above the Persian Gulf. You can see Babylon just a little bit above and to the left of that, and that actually would probably be where the city of Babel was. If you go off to the right, you see the city of Susa, which actually I believe is right on or right inside the modern border of Iran. It was actually part of the ancient Persian Empire. And if you know the story of Ruth, if you've ever seen the movie One Night with the King, the story of Ruth, where she saved the nation by appealing to her husband, who was the king of Persia at the time. That happened. They lived in the city of Susa. That was where the capital was. And then if you go to the very top of the screen, you see, and I had to write it in here because it's above where the picture got cut off, but that's where the city of Nineveh would be. And that was obviously the story of Jonah and the whale. Yet, despite all of these cities being culturally and linguistically connected, these ancient Sumerian and Akkadian cities that I mentioned a moment ago were constantly at war with each other. And so these weren't like simplistic brutes. These were smart people. They had knowledge of engineering and farming and agriculture and war. In fact, it was the ancient Akkadians and the Sumerians who were credited with developing military tactics and machines like siege machines. They also, specifically the Sumerians, invented what's called the phalanx formation. If you've ever seen any movies where there was like ancient warfare, if you see like a rectangular group of soldiers all packed very close together, carrying swords and shields, that is called a phalanx, and that was invented by the ancient Sumerians. But their contributions weren't simply military. The ancient Sumerians gave us the earliest form of writing, which was cuneiform, this pictograph type language. And they also invented a base 60 math system. Like the math that we run today is a base 10 system, right? We count by tens essentially. But this base 60 math system that the Sumerians invented gave us the 60-minute 60-second minute. Like, why are there 60 seconds in a minute? Because the Sumerians told us there was. Why do we have 60 minutes in an hour? Well, because the Sumerians told us. Why are there 360 degrees in a circle? Because the Sumerians told us. And they actually were also the ones that told us that there were 12 inches in a foot. Right? So they have had tremendous impact on, modern science, even obviously military warfare and language. Now, I said just a second ago that these cities were connected linguistically, right? And even the Bible says that, before the Tower of Babel, that there was one language, that everyone spoke a similar language. And we'll get to that story here coming up. But, Sumerian was the first language to be spoken in this Mesopotamian region. And that the Sumerian language basically gave way around the time of Abraham, which was probably 100 or so years later, gave way to the Akkadian language. So it started out as Sumerian and then kind of turned into Akkadian, and they are linguistically very, very similar. But Akkadian at the time, especially around the time of Abraham, was the language, the main language of the East. The Mediterranean area, the Mesopotamian area, even further into east into parts of Asia, it was the main language of trade, for scholarship, and certainly for religion. There's many references to Akkadian language being the liturgical language. Every time I hear the word liturgy, I think of Latin, I think of the Roman Catholics and all that kind of stuff. You imagine a Roman Catholic priest chanting in Latin. Well, that's what the Akkadian priest or the Babylonian priest would have done at the time. They would have been doing all the religious ceremonies in the Akkadian language. Now, apparently, Akkadian and Babylonian, which came later, are very, very similar, but they all come from the same Semitic family of languages. And remember, I explained how the word Semitic or Semite is a derivative of the name Shem, right? Shem being the father of Abraham, and Abraham being essentially the father of both the Arab nations and the Hebrew nation. And so, ancient Akkadian, ancient Babylonian are linguistically related to Arabic and Hebrew. Now, over time, languages come, they go, they merge, they meld together, they spawn different variants or different dialects, and the main language spoken in Mesopotamia and further to the west around the area where, Jerusalem and the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, that coastline, which is known as the Levant, the main language spoken in that area at the time of the Jews that when they were taken into captivity was actually Aramaic. Yeah, Aramaic, right? Aramaic was the common spoken language of the Jews, and it was actually the first language of the Assyrians. So the Aramaic language began in the early days as the main language of the Assyrian Empire, and then it became adopted by the Babylonian Empire. And Jesus himself spoke a Galilean version or dialect, as did all the Jews throughout Judea. And here's an interesting thought. I've known for a long time that Aramaic was what the Jews spoke, what Christ spoke, but we also know that they wrote in Greek because they lived at the time of Christ and the apostles, they lived in the Roman Empire, but Greek was the lingua franca. It was the language of the day. So pretty much everyone traded, and the teaching, all these things were done in the Greek language. But the Aramaic that Jesus spoke had its roots in ancient Chaldea and ancient Babylon, actually even in ancient Samaria. So nonetheless, Christ's native language was itself a descendant of ancient Akkadian language, and we can trace this back linguistically to ancient Akkad, ancient Sumer, and so this language survived from the time of the confusion of language from the Tower of Babel all the way forward to the time of Christ in different forms, right? What an amazing thought. So the obvious question is, where did this, the progression and the division of languages begin? And most of us know the answer to this. It was the Tower of Babel. So let's go to Genesis 11. Let's take a look at that story. Before we read there, just go to Genesis 11:1. Let me just make a couple of notes from Josephus. And I'm not going to quote him directly here, but I'm just going to give you some bullet points. But in Book 1 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus tells us that Noah and his sons were the first to come down out of the mountains after the flood and to live in the plains of Shinar. Remember, the plains of Shinar were basically that Mesopotamian region. So according to Josephus, after the flood, as they started to have new generations of people, the new generations were basically afraid that God was going to flood the earth again, and they wanted to stay on high ground. And so Noah and his sons had to convince this newer generation that it was safe to go down and to populate the earth. And Josephus writes that God gave Noah very specific instructions to tell your people to separate, to form colonies, to spread out, populate the earth, and enjoy the fruits of the earth. But these new generations feared flood. And they also feared that if they spread out, that they would basically weaken themselves by diluting their numbers, and that they wouldn't be able to protect themselves if somebody came and tried to overcome them. And so what ended up happening is they began to disobey Noah, and because God was instructing Noah, they began to disobey God. And they stayed close together instead of spreading out. They began to plant these cities like Babel, like Uruk, like Nineveh, like Susa. And they began to plan how they could keep themselves safe from flood and from calamity. Let's pick it up in Genesis 11:1. I'm reading in the Septuagint. And all the earth was one language, and there was one voice for all. And it happened when they moved from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And a person said to their neighbor, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them in fire." And the brick turned into stone for them, and the clay was asphalt for them. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose head will be as far as heaven, and we will make for ourselves a name before we are scattered upon the face of all the earth." Now, I remember being taught as a child that, they tried to build a tower that was so tall that they could get to and overthrow God. And then that actually is why God came down and confused the language. But it's really not what the Bible says at all. It just says that they wanted to build a very high tower, which Moses describes as, whose head will be as far as heaven. Now, if you remember from the discussion on the Creation Week, the word heaven just really in this context means sky or atmosphere. It doesn't mean where God lives, where his temple is. So if we understand that, then we realize, just as Josephus recorded, that they were just trying to build a flood-proof building, a place where they would be safe, just in case God decided that he was going to flood the earth again. Well, Now, there's one problem there. Obviously, they didn't learn from history because God promised Noah that he wouldn't flood the earth again. So there was no fear, at least in that regard. Now, Josephus tells us that it was actually Nimrod who built the tower. And I am going to quote from Josephus here. I've just got a couple of paragraphs, and this is from Book 1, Chapter 4 of the Antiquity of the Jews. Now, it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe to God as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence upon his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. I have one more paragraph to read, but a thought just occurred to me that, just like in the Garden of Eden where the serpent said to Eve, surely you will not die. He introduced doubt of God's word. Well, God promised that he wouldn't flood the earth. Yet he lied to the people and said, hey, you're happy through your own efforts. You don't need to rely on God, and you better protect yourself from a flood. Yet the Noahic covenant, the rainbow in the sky, says that God wouldn't do that again. Let me continue on here. Now the multitude were very ready to follow the determination of Nimrod, and to esteem it a piece of cowardice to submit to God. And they built a tower, neither sparing any pains nor being in any degree negligent about the work. And by reason of the multitude of hands employed in it, it grew very high sooner than anyone could expect. But the thickness of it was so great, and it was so strongly built, that thereby its great height seemed upon the view to be less than it really was. It was built of burnt brick cemented together with mortar made of bitumen, that it might not be liable to admit water. When God saw that they acted so madly, he did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not growing wiser by the destruction of the former sinners. But he caused a tumult among them, by producing in them diverse languages, and causing that through the multitude of those languages they should not be able to understand one another. Now, let me just make one comment there. Josephus says that God did not resolve to destroy them utterly, since they were not growing wiser by the destruction of the former sinners. It's such an interesting commentary. Now imagine God, and we've already talked about how God, the pre-incarnate Christ, the creator of all things, had no foreknowledge or prescience, no experience with his own creation. And so, he destroyed the flood the first time to get rid of all the wickedness. And then within a couple of generations, the world began to go wicked again, or was largely wicked. And so, in essence, what Josephus is saying is that God looked down and said, well, they didn't listen the first time, but I've already promised not to flood the earth. I need to do something different. Right? Let's continue on in verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of humans built. And the Lord said, look, there's one race and one language of all, and they started to do this, and now they will not fail in all things that they may undertake to do. Come and let us go down there to confound their language, that each of them will not hear the voice of their neighbor. And the Lord scattered them from that place upon the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city and the tower. Because of this, they called its name Confusion, or Babel, because there the Lord confounded the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord God scattered them upon the face of all the earth. There's a couple of interesting things to notice in those verses. First is Moses' use of the phrase sons of man. So it said the Lord went down to see what the sons of man had done. Remember in Genesis 6, when we saw the phrase the daughters of man, it referred to the female portion of the pagan nations, the disobedient ones. And so here the sons of man refers to the same thing, right? This is a second separation between those faithful to the covenant of God and those who began to trust in themselves and in the words and the power and authority of Nimrod. And this is why God said that he wouldn't destroy them utterly again, because it didn't work the first time. So he confused their languages. He spread them out. And from one language came all languages. But they went from understanding one another to not understanding. And I want to show you something. And this is I'm not sure if there's anything significant in this, but it is interesting. I noticed this as I was flying. I'm recording this in my hotel room in Boston, but as I was flying and reading through, I just started to see these parallels. So parallels between, and these are kind of opposite parallels or contrasts, I guess you would say, between the story of Babel and what happened with language at Pentecost. So at the story of Babel, we have people who are in one place who were told to scatter, but they stayed in one location disobediently. And in the story of Pentecost in the New Testament, in the book of Acts in chapter 1 and 2, we see the Jews who had been scattered coming back and going into one location to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. At the time of Babel, we had one tongue that was understood by all. But at the time of Pentecost and the diaspora or the dispersion, the Jews lived in different nations and spoke different languages, although many of them still spoke Hebrew. And in the story of the Tower of Babel, you went from where everyone understood each other to God changed the understanding to confusion, whereas in the story of Pentecost, you have confusion where under the influence of the holy breath of God, these people from the dispersed Jews that were gathered in one place were speaking in tongues, and everyone heard them in their own native language. And so from confusion, God brought understanding. And I don't know if there's a doctrinal or a theological meaning to this, but the parallels and the fact that it's the same phenomena but exactly the opposite, I think is very, very interesting, something I might have to mull over for a while. Nevertheless, what we know at this point is that God confused the languages and he spread out the people. And at the time, the supercontinent, right, we're post-flood, and we didn't go through it in our last lesson, but I've shared with you a couple of times before about, the hydroplate theory or catastrophic plate tectonics, that part of the flood, the change in the geography and geology was that these continental plates kind of broke open, and when two plates ran into each other, we got the formation of mountains and all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, the continents split into different plates and they started to drift apart. But it would take a very long time for the continents to drift far apart enough that it would appear like what we see if we look on a map of the world today. But in the beginning, these separated continents would still be connected by different land bridges. And there are, theories about how did man get from the Mesopotamian area, how did they get up to Siberia, to Alaska, to North America? Well, they migrated across these land bridges to the different continents that continued to separate and go apart. And that obviously led to all the different nations and peoples and tribes and tongues that we see scattered throughout the world today. But you remember how we used the population calculator to estimate the population of the pre-flood world, right? Please understand that the mathematical formula to calculate population growth is very well validated, right? It's not like that's in contention. But here's the question. How many people do you think were alive at the time of Nimrod? Now, he was only 2 generations off the ark, right? We have Ham, who had Cush, who had Nimrod. And the Bible doesn't tell us how old Nimrod was when he built the Tower of Babel. But we know it was before Abraham was born. And Abraham was born in the year 2000 Anno Mundi, or 2,000 years after creation. Or to give you some time perspective, Abraham was born 349 years after the flood. So we know that Nimrod and the Tower of Babel happened sometime before 349 years. Maybe it was 150, maybe it was 200, something like that. But we have to make some assumptions, right? How long is a generation? But if we make a few simple assumptions, like we did when we calculated the potential population prior to the flood, and also remember that these modern archaeologists estimate that the city of Uruk alone had, minimum 40,000 people, maybe as much as 80. But if we keep that 40,000 as a conservative estimate and say, hey, there were 10 similar cities in the world at that time, then you're looking at 400,000 people at the time of the Tower of Babel. So if we use the calculator and again make some simple assumptions, right? We start with 8 people that came off the ark, and these people were still living hundreds of years, and their the population growth would be quite higher because they have longer lifespans, and instead of having the modern average of 2.1 kids per year, maybe they're having 10 or maybe they're having 15. But if we assume that the growth rate was 5 times then what it was now because of longer lifespans and having more children during their years, in just 200 years after the flood, we could see the population of the world around the time of the Tower of Babel, if we assume that it happened around 200 years, the population could actually be a little over 800,000 people. And I think that should, change what you think about that time. I mean, growing up and, probably until not all that long ago, I thought that the pre-flood civilization was kind of barbaric, wearing animal hides, living in huts and, barely invented the wheel, that kind of thing. But honestly, I think that we don't give the pre-flood civilization much credit. I think that they were far more advanced. And I'm not suggesting that they were, some kind of advanced civilization with, technology and all that, although certainly maybe it was. I don't know. There's no way because we have no record of that. But I just know that it was not what a lot of the images and certainly movies portray, these barbarians. And then probably the same thing true. Like, how long would it have taken for the post-flood civilization to start building cities and developing battle tactics and irrigation canals, right? These were smart people, and they would have brought a certain amount of knowledge and understanding with them across the flood. But, these largely disobedient and unfaithful people would have taken not just, maybe some knowledge of building and all that kind of stuff. They would have taken with them a corrupted version of the lore and the story of God that was handed down to them from Noah and Shem, who would have got it from Seth and Enosh, because remember, Noah was the last of the righteous line of Seth. But before I get too far down that, let me say a few things about what happened in Mesopotamia and the legends and the mythology that grew up around Nimrod and his wife, a lady named Semiramis, how that set the stage for all of the pagan world religions that came centuries afterwards. And I really, truly do believe that, any modern day pagan religious story or character, I think we can trace back to Nimrod and his wife Semiramis. So probably the first thing to get out there is that modern religious and secular scholars, they often argue as to which came first, right? The religion of Babylon or the religion of Egypt, right? And which one influenced the other. So some say that all these religious stories began in Babylon and Mesopotamia, in ancient Sumeria, and then it went down to Egypt. Some say it was the other way around. Now, it doesn't really matter for you and I, but if you spend any time researching these ancient religions, you're going to see that there's a huge diversity of opinion over, what's true, who are real people, what's myth, what's legend, and, if and how different ancient religions are really just the same stories and the same characters in different places. For example, there's an ancient Babylonian goddess named Inanna, who secular scholars say is the same as Ishtar, who is the same as Astarte, who is the same as Aphrodite, and so on, right? And we can do that on the male side as well. Nevertheless, what we see in these ancient pagan systems is we see a rich pantheon of gods, or a very polytheistic schema. We see sun worship and star worship. We see nature worship. We see kings and emperors being worshipped as gods or hybrids. We see stories about gods or demons mating with humans and creating, hybrid man-god characters. And there's this recurrent theme of birth and death and rebirth, where in many of these ancient religions, a god comes back from the dead and he brings life to the earth and to the people. Well, I would submit to you that if he was truly God, he couldn't have died in the first place. That's just me, just saying. Now, in many of these ancient religions, There's often a story of a mother, a father, and a son. And sometimes the son is both the father and the son, and the father is both the father and the son. Meaning that in a lot of these stories, the father who at some point is revered as a god, basically dies before his pregnant wife gives birth to his own child. But when the child is born, the child is actually the reincarnation of the dead father. Kind of weird, but that's what it is. Now, as far as Nimrod goes, the Bible is largely silent on Nimrod, other than what we see in Genesis 11. Josephus adds a little bit, but not all that much, and he doesn't go into all the different lore that surrounds him from a kind of a mythological standpoint. And so there's very little that we can say accurately, and that means that anything that you read out there about Nimrod is probably coming from different religious traditions, secular historians, religious studies, and a lot of it is, of course, speculative and likely myth and legend. However, there are all these diversities of opinions, including in what I'm going to share with you right now. But these are diversity of opinions in aspects and details of the story, not in the larger story itself. And I think what you'll see if you spend any time looking at this is there's a surprising amount of uniformity and consistency. So one legend has it that Nimrod married a woman named Samuramat, and that would be a Sumerian name. Samur in Hebrew is the word Shinar. So the plain of Shinar, the plain of Samur. In Greek, she came to be known as Semiramis, and that's just the Greek version of Samur and Shinar. And according to one legend, and there are several, Nimrod met his wife in a brothel before he became king of Babylon, and as he was, fighting with other cities and communities, and eventually he became king. But somewhere along the way, he met his wife in a brothel, which, I guess being married to a prostitute or to a madame, if you will, probably doesn't lend much to your credibility as a king. So apparently they invented a story that Semiramis was a virgin that sprang up from the sea. One specific legend has that she was the half-human child of a sea goddess and a human man. And in fact, the name Samuramat means gift of the sea. That's what it actually means. Another legend says that she was delivered to the coastline as a giant egg and that doves hatched her, and all of a sudden there she was. Nevertheless, Semiramis initiated a religious system that was designed to support the rule. So basically it deified she and her husband. She herself ran the religious hierarchy and controlled the priesthood. Nimrod didn't do that. I guess he was maybe more of a warlord, if you will, but nevertheless, she ran the religious institution, and worship of Semiramis herself later became the root of all Babylonian goddess worship. And in this false religion that she taught, basically her origin story was that there was this great dragon or great serpent who's the true God, and that he had been temporarily defeated or usurped by a pretender or a false god, which I think for all descriptions sounds an awful lot like Jehovah. The dragon or the serpent created man, not the other god, but the dragon and serpent did. But he created man in a very pitiful state, but he promised that there would be a child born of a divine mother that would eventually free all of mankind. And that child would basically conquer the fake god, would become God himself, and then would bring rule rightfully back to the serpent or back to the dragon. And you can see the commonalities there, right? So eventually Nimrod and Semiramis had a falling out because apparently she became pregnant with someone else's child. One legend has her explaining that she became impregnated by a beam of light and that her son was divine because it was born from the sun, or he was born from the sun. Another one, one particular year, like part of their religious celebrations, if you will, particularly their New Year's festival, involved different courses of hallucinogenic drugs. And so what they would do is they would gather for their New Year celebration. Everyone would get high in these hallucinogens. And what they would do is they would take a 1-year-old lamb and literally tear it limb from limb while it was alive and apparently eat its raw flesh. And that was part of their festival. So they would basically kill that lamb as a symbol of the dying old year, and they would bring a new lamb in to represent the new year, and then they would keep that lamb for a year and they would kill it the next year. But nevertheless, in one of the legends, basically says that after Nimrod realized that his wife was pregnant with a child that was not from him, they obviously had a lot of conflict, a lot of separation. They started to vie for power. But because Semiramis controlled the priesthood and the religious institution, what happened in this one particular celebration was that in this drug-induced frenzy, she basically made her priests and the guests take Nimrod and tear him from limb. And again, part of the story is that she took his body parts and she spread them all around the nation. Now, there's another story that says that it wasn't in that New Year's celebration, but it was Shem, the son of Noah, from which we get the line of Christ. But Shem was so disgusted by his great nephew Nimrod's perversions that Shem himself cut Nimrod in pieces and scattered his body parts just to prove that he wasn't a god. Well, either way, again, lots of diversity of opinion and stories. Either way, Semiramis claimed that Nimrod had ascended to heaven and became one with the sun, which obviously fed into their practices of sun and star worship. And this began the worship of Nimrod as the sun god. And eventually, Semiramis herself became the moon goddess. Some legends say that when her son was born, that it was Nimrod reincarnated. And here we have that death rebirth cycle, and we have the father actually being himself his own son in that crazy little cycle. But she named her son Demu in Sumerian. That name means blood. In Babylonian, his name was Demuz. In Hebrew, the name was Tammuz. And we see a reference to Judean or Jewish women worshiping pagans in the book of Ezekiel, where God shows the prophet women in Judea who were weeping for Tammuz, which was part of the Tammuz story, which we're not going to go into. But Tammuz in Hebrew is the same as Adonis in Greek and Cupid in Rome. And Cupid, of course, is a central figure in the modern day celebration of Valentine's Day. Now, because Semiramis was the mother of the emperor, and the emperor was apparently Nimrod reincarnated, she began to receive worship as the mother of God. Another title was the Queen of Heaven. We see that particularly in the Egyptian traditions. And of course, anyone with a Roman Catholic background will recognize that these are titles that the Roman Catholic Church, as it began to kind of absorb pagan rituals and terminology and practices, Mary became known as the Queen of Heaven. In fact, this term Queen of Heaven appears several different times in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 7 and chapter 44, in the context of Israel being spiritually unfaithful and women Jewish women celebrating or worshiping the Queen of Heaven in these pagan rituals by baking cakes and pouring out drinks or libations. Now, legend has it that after Semiramis died, she herself ascended into heaven, and she returned to earth inside a large egg, which fell into the Euphrates River, and the egg was pushed ashore by a dove. And this kind of sounds a little bit like some of the legends about how she actually met Nimrod, but apparently this egg was pushed ashore by a dove, and she emerged from the egg as the goddess Ishtar, or Astarte, which most will say that this gives us the English word Easter. And in order to show her gratitude to the dove, this Semiramis / Ishtar / Astarte, she turned the dove into an egg-laying rabbit. And of course, the eggs, the egg-laying rabbit, these are all signs of fertility. And of course, you can't deny the connection to, the Easter egg hunt. Now, remember in Egypt, and Egypt was founded by Mizraim, one of Ham's other sons. In Egypt, they believed that their goddess Isis was married to the god Osiris, who was killed and cut up into pieces by a jealous god named Set. Right? And you can see the similarities. Isis, however, was able to go around and find all the different body parts of Osiris, and she found everything but his male body parts, which she replaced with a golden one, which caused him to be temporarily reborn through magic, and he impregnated her with her son Horus. And we can trace this story on and on and on through many different ancient cultures. And so it appears that the story of Nimrod and Semiramis and the legends and the mythology that they built up around themselves basically became the pattern for all ancient religions. The story changed slightly. The names obviously changed based on the language, but the elements of the story are really all the same. Now, we're not going to go into it in a lot of detail, and I'm not sure what Tim's plan is, but I would imagine at some point in the Bereans Revelation study between chapters 13 and 18, Tim is probably at some point going to be talking about what's called the Whore of Babylon. She's basically the mother of all paganism, and there's connections between the figure described in the book of Revelation and some of these things that we're talking about here. But I'm going to leave that to Tim to develop in detail in the Berean study. So for you and I, whether we're looking at early religions and we're recognizing there's this high degree of similarity, basically it means that they all came from the same source. If you look at the fact that today there are over 200 worldwide flood myths that scholars have identified. And this is unfortunately taken the wrong way by atheists. They go, well, everyone's got a flood story. Well, anytime you have a flood story spread around the whole world, guess what it means? Well, it means that there was a worldwide flood. Many pagan cultures actually use the flood story to explain creation, which I guess in a sense makes sense because the post-flood world was created by the flood itself. The only way that you get this extensive commonality is because the stories and myths are versions of a singular truth. There was a worldwide flood. If we accept that there are regional and cultural and religious differences, that, the widespread uniformity with the characters and the stories and the themes basically confirm that they all came from a single common source of truth, but they're all themselves perversions of the truth. And that brings us to why the early pagans, basically there was such a focus on worshiping the stars and the sun and the moon. Because when Noah came off the ark, he brought with him the story of God. He brought with him the story of the Mazzaroth, the constellations that was handed down to him through the righteous line of Seth. Basically God preserved his own story through the flood and brought it into the post-flood world. And while Noah and his sons would have begun to teach it, because the descendants of Ham in particular became so wicked so quickly that they trusted in themselves and in Nimrod. And Nimrod and Semiramis focused all their religiousness to themselves and built up this pagan mythology, yet they based it on a perversion of the story that God put in the stars. When God confused the languages, after the Nimrod and Semiramis pagan mythology had already taken root, when God confused the languages and spread the people around the world, that was the seed or the kernel of all pagan religions, of all pagan methods of worship. And again, the themes are the same, the story is the same, but the characters and the names and the details vary slightly from place to place, but the commonality points back to a central origin. And that's why all cultures and religions have, not just a flood story. They have all of these, eerily similar pagan mythologies. It's why all these different cultures and religions actually also have a Mazzaroth or have a zodiac. Every single major religion and culture in the world has one. And they're all essentially the same, both in symbols as well as design. The stories might change a little bit, but we can't escape the fact that the Mazzaroth, the zodiac, spans culture and it spans religion. And it's still around, 2,400 years, not 2,400 years actually, sorry about that, like 4,400 years after the flood itself. And the question is why? Like, why do we see a Mazzaroth in Babylonian, Assyrian, and Egyptian cultures? Why do we see it in Hindu and Chinese cultures? Why is there a Celtic Mazzaroth? Why is there Scandinavian Mazzaroths? Why is there even a Mayan, Aztec, and American Indian Mazzaroth? Well, the answer is because they all came from the same place. They all came from the story of God. Now, this is a quote from a paper. I came across this just doing some background research, and this is a paper that was written presumably either by a professor. I couldn't figure out if it was written by a professor or a student and requirements of a course, but nevertheless, it was in the Department of East Asia Studies at the University of Oregon. And this paper was basically examining the zodiacs, or the Mazzaroths, of all the different cultures of the world. And here's the quote. It says this: all the zodiacs, together with their divisions into constellations, must have one common origin, which can only have been in Babylon, the home of ancient astronomy. Now, that's the secular view, that astronomy began with Babylon. Now, Josephus tells us that Seth was the father. Before the flood, Seth was the father of astronomy, that God had entrusted to him the knowledge of the stars, the story that he put in creation in that first 6 days. It was handed down, of course, to Noah, and it was actually handed to Abraham, who then, according to Josephus, brought it to the Chaldeans, or to the Babylonians. And with that, we're going to end our introduction. So next week, we're going to start into the first part of the story of God. In essence, the introduction is the first part, but as it relates to the Mazzaroth, there are 12 stories to tell. And so we begin with the first part of the story, the constellation of Virgo, which we know associates with the Abrahamic covenant. Now, just to let you know, I'm not going to go into detail about the covenant. We will talk about the covenant, but the whole point of this study is to tell the stories of the people and what was happening at the time. And in reality, the very first part of the Mazzaroth, the sign of Virgo, is the very first step that God begins to take in the post-flood world to set everything right, to fulfill the prophecy that we saw back in Genesis 3:15, which is really the first iteration of the gospel. Well, I hope you have enjoyed the introduction, and we'll meet again next week, and we'll talk about the Mazzaroth Virgo and the story of Abraham. God bless. Take care.